The snow came down in sheets, thick and silent, swallowing the world. They were giving her away. At 18, they were casting her out, a debt to be paid to the mountain. She sat in the back of the wagon, a threadbare quilt pulled around her shoulders, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes she couldn't see, the ghosts of the townsfolk who had whispered her fate into existence. The wagon stopped. Before her stood a cabin, half buried in snow, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney like a final stubborn breath. And then the door opened. He was a giant. A man made of pine and winter, with a beard that held the frost and eyes as dark as a clouded overnight sky. Two small children, a boy and a girl, peeked from behind his legs, their faces pale and thin in the gloom. The townsman driving the wagon didn't even get down. He grumbled something about duty, about a debt owed to Jonah McGraw, and then he shoved her out into the snow. Just like that. The wagon creaked and groaned as it turned, disappearing back into the white nothingness, leaving her alone with the mountain man and his silent children. Jonah McGraw didn't move. He just stood there, a stone wall of a man watching her. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was empty. The little boy, maybe 10 years old, stared with open suspicion. The girl, younger, clutched her father's coat, her breath making tiny clouds in the frozen air. The silence was so heavy it felt like you could hold it in your hands. Finally, without a word, Jonah stepped aside, holding the door open. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. She stepped inside. The warmth from the hearth fire hit her face, but it didn't touch the ice in her bones. The cabin was one room, spare but clean. Rough logs, the smell of wood smoke. Shelves were lined with jars, and a quilt with faded stitching was folded on a bed frame. It belonged to another woman, she knew. His late wife. She looked away, feeling like a thief. Jonah shut the door, and the sound echoed with a terrible finality. The world was gone. There was only this room, this man, these children, and the storm. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the floor, shivering. The children had already scurried to the fireplace, their backs to her. Jonah added a log to the fire, the flames lighting up the hard lines of his face. He didn't look at her when he spoke, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "There's stew on the stove." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Hunger was a sharp pain in her stomach, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She was an intruder, a ghost. So she sat on a small stool by the wall, pulling the quilt tighter, and waited. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. The boy, Thomas, kept glancing over, his eyes narrowed. He was judging her, waiting for her to fail. She closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear. But the town had already made its decision. She was a parcel, unwanted, undeliverable, and this was her final stop. The first night was an eternity. She lay on a cot in the corner, listening to the storm rage against the cabin walls. Sleep wouldn't come. All she could see were the faces from town. The women who turned their backs. The men who dropped their eyes. The preacher who shook his head with that sad, useless pity. Given away because no one else would have her. The words were a brand on her skin. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not here. Not in this cage. Morning arrived, pale and frozen. She rose before anyone else, a habit born from a life of trying to be useful, invisible. She coaxed the embers in the hearth back to life, then found the water bucket nearly empty. Pulling a shawl around her, she stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was deep, the world a vast, empty white. The rope on the well was stiff with ice, and her hands were raw by the time she'd filled the bucket. When she came back inside, Jonah was awake. He was sitting at the table just watching her. He didn't say a word, but his eyes stayed on her for a second longer than they ever had before. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Days began to bleed into one another, a long, slow rhythm of snow and silence. She learned the ways of the cabin. The sound of Jonah's axe splitting wood, a steady, powerful thud that echoed through the trees. The way Thomas sharpened his knives, with a grim focus that was too old for a boy his age. The soft humming of the little girl, Mary Beth, as she sewed little scraps of fabric together. She did what she could. She mended, she swept, she cooked. She tried to earn her place, a place she never asked for. But Thomas met every effort with a stone wall of resentment. One night, she offered him a piece of bread she'd baked, still warm from the hearth. He just glared at her. "We don't need you," he muttered, and turned his back. The words were colder than the wind outside. A sharp, brutal sting. But then there were small things, little cracks in the ice. One afternoon, Mary Beth quietly placed a tiny, crudely carved wooden bird in her lap, then ran off before she could say thank you. Another night, she found a small, perfect stack of kindling next to her cot. She knew it was Jonah. He never said a word about it. But he had done it. These were the moments she held on to. Tiny flickers of warmth in the suffocating cold. Proof that she wasn't just a shadow in the corner. But the winter was not done with them. A blizzard descended one evening, a screaming monster of wind and snow that shook the very logs of the cabin. For days they were trapped. The world outside vanished, replaced by a howling white void. Their supplies dwindled. The last of the salted meat was gone. The cornmeal was a fine dust at the bottom of the sack. Jonah's face grew harder, his silence deeper, heavier. Thomas's anger became a sharp, hungry thing. "There'd be more for us if you weren't here," he hissed at her one night, his voice a low poison. Jonah was outside, checking the woodpile, and the boy's words were meant just for her. She had no answer. Because in his mind, it was true. She was another mouth to feed, an anchor pulling them down. Later that night, by the low light of a single candle, she saw a tear in the sleeve of his coat. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but she took out her needle and thread. She stitched the tear with small, even stitches, making it stronger than it was before. In the morning, he wore the coat without a word. But when he thought she wasn't looking, she saw him touch the seam. And she saw the shame in his eyes. The storm got worse. It was a physical presence, trying to break its way in. Jonah seemed to run on nothing but will, fighting the storm to keep the woodpile stocked, his beard caked in ice when he came back inside. He never asked for help, but she could see the exhaustion carving new lines into his face. One evening, the wind was so fierce the fire began to gutter, starved for air. The woodbox was almost empty. Jonah was asleep in his chair, a rare moment of surrender. She couldn't wake him. She couldn't let the fire die, so she did the only thing she could. She pulled on one of his heavy fur coats, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped out into the blizzard. It was like walking into a wall of knives. The cold was a living thing, tearing at her skin, stealing the breath from her lungs. The snow was a blinding, churning chaos. She fought her way to the woodpile, her body screaming in protest. She gathered an armful of frozen logs, heavy as stone, and began the impossible journey back to the cabin door. She fell once, twice, the world spinning into a dizzying vortex of white. She thought she was going to die right there, just a few feet from safety. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the storm. Jonah. He was a mountain moving through the blizzard. His face was a mask of fury. Or maybe it was something else. Before she could make sense of it, her legs gave out. She collapsed, the logs scattering around her. But she didn't hit the ground. Strong arms caught her, lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her inside, the warmth of his body a shocking contrast to the frozen world. He set her down gently by the fire, piling blankets on top of her. His hands, rough and calloused, checked her fingers for frostbite. They were surprisingly gentle. For the first time since she'd arrived, She saw a crack in his armor. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They were blazing, fierce and dark and filled with an emotion she couldn't name. It looked like anger, but it felt like fear. He had been afraid for her. The thought was so stunning it left her breathless. He turned away abruptly, stoking the fire with a violent energy, his back ramrod straight. She lay there, warmth slowly returning to her body, listening to the storm. And for the first time, she felt a tiny, fragile seed of belonging. It was terrifying. In the flickering firelight, she could see the children watching. Mary Beth's eyes were wide with wonder. Even Thomas looked different, not angry, just quiet. She had survived the town. She had survived the storm. But she was beginning to think the real storm was just beginning. Right here inside this cabin. The thaw came slowly, like a secret whispered between the mountains. Patches of earth appeared, dark and wet against the melting snow. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was taking place, one just as slow and uncertain. The girl, Ilara, had found her footing. She was no longer just a burden, a debt. She was a part of the rhythm of the place. She mended and cooked and tended the fire, and in the quiet spaces between chores, she felt the silence change. It was no longer empty. It was watchful. Jonah was still a man of few words, but his eyes followed her now. Not with suspicion, but with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. He started leaving a cup of hot tea for her by the hearth in the mornings. He never mentioned it. He just did it. Thomas was the last wall to crumble. After the blizzard, his hostility had faded, replaced by a grudging respect. One afternoon he was trying to fix a broken trap, his fingers clumsy, his face tight with frustration. He cursed under his breath and threw it down. Ilara picked it up. She didn't say anything. She just sat down and with patient fingers began to work the bent metal back into place. Her father had been a blacksmith, a lifetime ago. The skills were buried deep, but they were still there. Thomas watched her, his jaw slack with surprise. When she handed the repaired trap back to him, he just stared at it, then up at her. "How did you do that?" he whispered. "My father taught me," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken of her family. After that, something shifted. He started talking to her. First, just questions about traps and tools. Then, stories about his mother. Small, precious memories he had locked away. He told her his mother had planted a garden of herbs by the creek every spring. He missed the smell of them. It was a bridge. A fragile, tentative bridge, but it was there. But the town below had a long memory. When the path was clear enough, Jonah needed to go for supplies. He hesitated, then looked at Ilara. "You should come," he said. It wasn't a question. They walked into town side by side, the children between them. And the whispers started immediately. They followed them like flies, buzzing and ugly. Martha Pike, a woman whose face was a permanent scowl, stood outside the general store, her arms crossed. "Look at him," she said, her voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "The great Jonah McGraw, saddled with another mouth to feed. Can't even keep a roof over their heads." Her eyes, sharp and cruel, landed on Ilara. "Some people are just bad luck." Sheriff Amos Cutter was leaning against a post, polishing a silver badge. He didn't look up, but a thin smirk played on his lips. "A man's gotta pay his debts, Martha," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Even the foolish ones." Ilara felt her face burn. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But Jonah stopped. He turned slowly, his sheer size making the air around him feel heavy. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked right at Martha Pike. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs like an axe through dead wood. "This girl," he said, and his voice was different. It held a protective edge she had never heard before. "She saved my children. That fire would have taken everything. She ran into the flames when any sane person would have run away. He took a step closer, and Martha actually flinched. Her name is Alara, and if I hear you speak it again without respect, you'll answer to me. He then turned his gaze to the sheriff. The smirk on Amos Cutter's face vanished. For a long second, the two men just looked at each other, and the air crackled with a silent, dangerous energy. The sheriff looked away first. The walk back to the mountain was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of strangers, but the shared silence of allies. They were a unit now. Them against the world. When they got back to the blackened skeleton of their home, Jonah didn't pause. He picked up a half-burned beam and began to clear the rubble. Thomas, without being asked, joined him. Alara took Mary Beth's hand and started gathering usable stones for a new foundation. They would rebuild. Together. That night, huddled under a makeshift shelter of canvas and pine boughs, Thomas couldn't sleep. He crept over to where Alara was sitting, watching the stars. "The fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't an accident." Alara turned to him. "What do you mean?" "I was getting water from the creek just before it started. I saw someone, a man, standing in the trees, watching the cabin. He had something shiny on his coat." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes wide with a fear he had been holding in for weeks. "It was a badge. It was Sheriff Cutter." The world tilted on its axis. The fire wasn't bad luck. It wasn't sparks from the chimney. It was deliberate, an attack. The sheriff hadn't been making a casual remark in town. He had been issuing a warning, a threat. Jonah had known. His confrontation with Amos wasn't just about defending her honor. It was a declaration of war, and Alara finally understood. The debt the town claimed Jonah owed them wasn't about money. It was about silence. Jonah McGraw knew something. Something the town and its sheriff would burn the world down to keep hidden. And now, by standing with him, she wasn't just an outcast anymore. She was a target. They worked relentlessly to rebuild, their movements fueled by a new, unspoken urgency. Every snap of a twig in the woods made them jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Jonah taught Alara how to use an axe, his large hands guiding hers on the handle. He taught Thomas how to set snares along the perimeter, not just for food, but for warning. They were fortifying their position, preparing for a siege. One evening, as they sorted through the few salvaged items from the fire, Alara found a small, scorched metal box. It had been hidden beneath a floorboard, protected from the worst of the flames. It was locked. Jonah saw it in her hands, and his face went pale. He took it from her, his fingers trembling slightly. He pulled a key from a leather cord around his neck and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal, his wife's. "I thought it was gone," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He opened it, and Alara could see pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. He read for a long time, his jaw tightening with every turned page. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes dark with a grief so profound it stole her breath. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice rough. "She wasn't just a gardener. She was the town's healer. She knew things, secrets. People would confess things to her they wouldn't even tell the preacher." He pointed to a passage in the journal. "She found out what Cutter was doing. He runs this whole valley like his own personal kingdom. Extortion, theft. People who stood up to him had accidents. Their barns would burn, their livestock would vanish." He flipped a few more pages. But it was worse than that. Much worse. He stopped, his finger resting on an entry dated the week before his wife's death. Alara leaned closer to read it. The entry described a secret meeting Sarah had witnessed by the old silver mine. Sheriff Cutter was there, along with Martha Pike's husband and a few other prominent townsmen. They were selling parcels of land that didn't belong to them, using forged deeds to trick newcomers. And the land they were selling, it belonged to Alara's family. Her father hadn't just been a blacksmith. He had owned a significant plot of timberland, a fact the town had conveniently forgotten after he and her mother died in a sudden fever outbreak a few years back. The same outbreak that had left Alara an orphan, dependent on the town's charity. It wasn't a fever. Alara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. It was murder. They had killed her parents for that land, and Sarah McGraw had found out. The journal's final entry was chillingly simple. Amos knows I saw them. He came to the cabin today. He told me to forget what I saw. He said some secrets are worth dying for. A week later, Sarah was dead. The town said she fell from the high ridge while gathering herbs. An accident. But it was no accident. And Thomas, who had been hiding in the woodshed that day, had seen Sheriff Cutter leaving the cabin just before he heard his mother scream. He had been too young, too scared to understand. Until now. This changed everything. They hadn't sent Alara to Jonah to pay a debt. They sent her to him as a message, a cruel, twisted joke. They sent the daughter of the people they murdered to the husband of the woman who discovered their crime. They thought he was a broken man, a silent giant who would never challenge them. They were wrong, and they had underestimated her. They saw her as a cast-off, a piece to be moved on their board. They didn't realize they had just sent him his greatest ally, his partner, the spark that would ignite the fire. Jonah closed the journal. He looked from Alara to his son, his face a grim mask of resolve. "He's not going to get away with it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not anymore." But they all knew what that meant. Sheriff Cutter wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He had already tried to burn them out once. The next time he would come to finish the job. And he would be coming soon. The mountain was no longer a refuge. It was about to become a battleground. The air on the mountain grew thin and sharp, charged with the tension of what was to come. They were no longer just building a home. They were building a fortress. Jonah, Alara, and Thomas worked as one, their movements economical and precise. They rigged deadfalls along the main path. They dug pits lined with sharpened stakes, hidden under a thin layer of leaves and pine needles. Mary Beth, too young to understand the danger, but old enough to feel the fear, was tasked with gathering smooth, heavy stones, piling them at the edge of the ridge overlooking the approach to their camp. Every action was a silent vow. They would not be victims. They would not be erased. Jonah showed Alara the secret places of the mountain his father had shown him. A narrow cave hidden behind a waterfall, its entrance obscured by thick moss. A game trail that wound its way up the sheer rock face, invisible from below. These were their escape routes, their strategic advantages. In the evenings, they didn't sit by the fire. They sat in the shadows, listening. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every call of a night bird sounded like a signal. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of Alara's stomach. But something else was growing alongside it. A fierce, defiant strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer the frightened girl from the wagon. She was a survivor, a fighter. She was fighting for this man, for these children, for this strange, broken family that had become her own. One afternoon, Jonah took her aside. He handed her a long, heavy hunting rifle. It was old but immaculately cared for. "Sarah's," he said gruffly. "She was a better shot than I am." He spent hours teaching her how to load, aim, and fire. The kick of the rifle against her shoulder was brutal, but she learned. She practiced until her arm was bruised and her ears rang, firing at pine cones and knots in distant trees. She had to be ready. They all did. The signal came just after dawn 3 days later. It was one of Thomas's snares. A simple tripwire connected to a series of empty tin cans 100 yards down the path. The sudden, frantic rattling echoed through the silent morning air. They were coming. Jonah's face was grim. "Alara, take Mary Beth to the cave. Stay there. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." Alara shook her head, clutching the rifle. "No." I'm staying with you. Jonah looked at her, and for a moment she thought he would argue. But then he saw the look in her eyes, the same iron will he saw in the mirror every morning. He simply nodded. Thomas, you know what to do. The boy, his face pale but his eyes steady, gave a sharp nod and disappeared into the trees, a small but deadly shadow. Jonah and Alara took their positions behind a makeshift barricade of logs and rock they had built at the edge of their clearing. They waited. The sound of horses came first, then voices. Sheriff Amos Cutter rode into the clearing, flanked by 4 men. They were not deputies. They were thugs, men with cruel eyes and guns strapped to their hips. Martha Pike's husband was one of them. The sheriff reined in his horse, a confident smirk on his face. He scanned the burned-out cabin, the half-finished new structure. "McGraw!" he called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "I heard you had some trouble up here. Just came to see if you needed a hand." Jonah stepped out from behind the barricade, his own rifle held loosely in one hand. He was a towering, intimidating figure against the morning sun. "We're fine, Amos. You can go now." The sheriff's smirk widened. "Now, that ain't very neighborly. I think we'll stay a while." He dismounted slowly. "See, I think you have something that belongs to me. A little book. I'd like it back." His eyes darted around, searching for Alara. "And the girl. She's got no place here. She's coming back with me." "That's not going to happen," Jonah said, his voice flat and cold as stone. "Isn't it?" The sheriff laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It's 5 of us, Jonah, against 1 broken-down mountain man." "It's 2," Alara said, stepping out beside Jonah, her rifle raised and aimed squarely at the sheriff's chest. The men behind him shifted nervously. The smirk on Cutter's face faltered for a second. He hadn't counted on this. He hadn't counted on her. "Brave girl," Cutter sneered, recovering quickly. "But foolish." He raised his hand, a signal to his men. "Get them." Just as his men started to raise their rifles, a piercing whistle cut through the air. It came from the trees high above them. One of the thugs cried out and grabbed his shoulder, a small, feathered dart sticking out of his coat. It was Thomas. Before anyone could react, another whistle, and another dart found its mark in a second man's arm. They weren't lethal, just painful and distracting, tipped with a paste of stinging nettles Sarah had taught him how to make. The element of surprise was theirs. "Now!" Jonah roared. He and Alara fired at the same time, not to kill, but to intimidate. Their shots splintered the tree trunk right next to the sheriff's head. The thugs panicked. This wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. They were being attacked from 2 directions, by a ghost in the trees and 2 crack shots behind a fortress of logs. But Sheriff Cutter was not a man who panicked. He was enraged. He drew his own pistol and fired wildly towards Alara. The bullet whizzed past her ear, so close she felt the heat of it. Jonah tackled her, pulling her down behind the barricade as a volley of shots erupted from the sheriff's men. Splinters flew from the logs around them. They were pinned down. The advantage was gone. "I'm going to burn this whole mountain down with you on it, McGraw!" the sheriff screamed, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. "You and that little witch and your brat!" They were trapped. The thugs were advancing, using the trees for cover. It was only a matter of time before they were overrun. Jonah was reloading, his movements swift and sure, but Alara knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them. Just as one of the men broke from cover, making a run for their flank, a new sound echoed through the canyon. It was a roar, a deep, guttural sound that was not human. Everyone froze. Even the sheriff lowered his gun, his eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of primal fear. Out from the dense woods to their left lumbered a massive black bear. It rose on its hind legs, towering over them all, its fur matted and a long, ugly scar across its snout. It let out another deafening roar. Alara recognized it. Jonah had pointed it out once, a notoriously ill-tempered bear he called Scar. He had warned her to stay clear of its territory, a territory that ended right at the edge of their clearing, a territory the sheriff and his men had just blindly blundered into. The bear wasn't attacking them. It was defending its home. It swiped a massive paw, and the thug who had been trying to flank them screamed as he was thrown through the air like a rag doll. The other men stared in horror, their bravado evaporating in an instant. This wasn't part of the plan. They hadn't signed up to fight a demon bear from the depths of the forest. They turned and ran, scrambling for their horses, their only thought to escape. Sheriff Cutter stood his ground for a second, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. He raised his pistol to fire at the bear, but before he could, Jonah was on him. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He didn't use his rifle. He hit the sheriff with a single brutal punch that sent him sprawling to the ground, his pistol flying from his hand. The bear, seeing the remaining threat neutralized, gave one last rumbling growl and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Silence descended on the clearing. It was over. Jonah stood over the dazed sheriff, his chest heaving. Thomas scrambled down from the trees, and Mary Beth, who had disobeyed orders and watched the whole thing from a hiding spot, ran into Alara's arms. They had won. They had faced down the monster from the town, and with an unexpected assist from a monster of the woods, they had won. Jonah hauled the sheriff to his feet. Amos Cutter was a different man now. His face was bloody, his eyes filled with fear. The power he held over the valley was gone, broken on the rocks of this mountain. "It's over, Amos," Jonah said, his voice quiet but final. He picked up the journal from where Alara had placed it safely behind the barricade. "Everyone is going to know. About Alara's parents, about my wife, about everything." He tied the sheriff's hands and threw him onto his own horse. The other thugs had vanished, leaving their injured companion behind. They would take the sheriff down to the next county, to a marshal who wasn't in his pocket. Justice was coming. As they prepared to leave, Jonah turned to Alara. He looked at her, standing there with his daughter in her arms, his son by her side, holding the rifle that had belonged to his first love. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "You were right to stay," he said. And in those 5 words, she heard everything he couldn't say. "Thank you. I need you. You belong here." The sun was rising higher, burning away the morning mist. They looked at the half-built cabin, at the scars on the land and on themselves. It was a long way from being whole, but for the first time, it felt like home. A home they had fought for, a home they had won, a home they would build together, splinter by splinter, stone by stone. The mountain had taken so much from them, but it had also given them the one thing they all needed: each other. And as they started the long walk down, leading a disgraced sheriff toward his reckoning, Alara knew she was no longer the girl who had been cast away. She was the woman who had found her way home. The journey down the mountain was a grim, silent procession. Jonah led the sheriff's horse, his face set like granite. Alara walked beside him, while Thomas followed, making sure none of Cutter's injured but still dangerous men tried anything. The story they were about to tell would tear the town apart, exposing the rot that had festered beneath its quiet surface for years. When they reached the neighboring town of Stone Creek, the marshal listened, his eyes growing wider with every word Jonah spoke and every passage he read from Sarah's journal. The evidence was irrefutable. Sheriff Amos Cutter, the tyrant of the valley, was arrested. His reign was over. Word traveled fast. By the time they returned to their own valley, the news had arrived before them. The town was in chaos. People gathered in the street, shouting, arguing. The men who had sided with Cutter were suddenly isolated, their power gone. Martha Pike saw them coming and scurried back into her house, slamming the door. The shame was a palpable thing. When they walked past the general store, the owner rushed out, pressing a sack of flour and sugar into Alara's hands. "This is for you," he stammered, "for what you've been through. We didn't know." But they had known. Or at least, they had chosen not to know. They had allowed the darkness to grow because it was easier than fighting it. Now the light was shining in, and it was ugly. It would take a long time for the town to heal, to earn back its soul. But it was a start. Alara was no longer a cast-off. She was a hero. The girl who had been sent away to be silenced had come back and given the entire valley its voice back. They returned to the mountain, to the quiet and the clean air and the half-built cabin. The work was hard, but it was good work. The townsfolk, in a collective act of penance, started leaving supplies at the base of the mountain path for them. Nails, salted meat, blankets, tools. No one ever saw who left them. They just appeared, like offerings to the spirits of the mountain. One day, a bundle of fresh herbs was left, the very kind Thomas said his mother used to grow. The cabin rose from the ashes, stronger and brighter than before. Jonah and Alara worked side by side, a comfortable silence between them, a language of shared glances and small smiles. The children's laughter, which had been so rare, now echoed through the trees. Thomas taught Alara the names of the birds. Mary Beth wove her a crown of wildflowers. They were a family. Not by blood, but by fire and snow and courage. One evening, when the cabin was finally finished and the first stars were appearing in the sky, Jonah came and sat beside her on the porch steps. He was holding the small wooden bird Mary Beth had given her so long ago. He had smoothed its rough edges, carved delicate feathers into its wings. He handed it to her. "My Sarah," he said, his voice low. "She would have liked you." It was the highest praise he could give, a bridge between his past and his future. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and warm, and it enveloped hers completely. "This mountain is a hard place, Alara, but it's a good place. There's room here for a new garden." He looked at her, and in his dark eyes she no longer saw the emptiness of a broken man. She saw warmth. She saw hope. She saw a home. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had found hers. She wasn't a debt to be paid. She was a treasure that had been found. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the giant of a man who was her protector, her partner, her family, and watched the stars come out over their mountain. It just goes to show you that sometimes the places we are sent to be broken are the very places we are meant to be rebuilt. The darkest paths can lead to the brightest homes, and the quietest people can have the strongest hearts. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next tale we uncover from the shadows.